Good afternoon and welcome to The Big Picture, live on University Radio Nottingham with Felix Hawes.
And Thomas Gregory.
Joining us today we have Josh.
Hello.
And Arthur.
Hi.
Hello Arthur. Welcome to the show. Today we'll be talking about Russia-Ukraine. Unfortunately the situation is still ongoing in the east of Europe. We'll also be talking about Gavin Williamson, who's been knighted. And we're going to be talking about Nigel Farage's latest endeavour, which is his net zero referendum campaign. But first of all, Russia-Ukraine. So Russia invaded Ukraine, I think about 2 weeks ago now, and Ukrainians are still fighting strong. And joining us today, as I mentioned, is Arthur. Arthur, you were born in Ukraine.
Yeah, I moved over when I was 2 years old, and but I have strong ties, lots of family over there. So I guess I'm just here to kind of give my perspective, also some context, kind of a lot of the conflict, and answer any kind of questions you might be interested in.
Well, let's start with, and thank you for coming on, let's start with something that Russia will claim, and I imagine you'll be able to refute it. Russia claims that Ukraine are militarising and threatening them. They are run by Nazis. And that NATO is an aggressor. There are also some people in this country that might share similar views, although they are on the fringes of politics. What do you make of these claims that Russia has put against the country you were born in?
Well, clearly is Putin trying to justify kind of a lot of what he's doing. I feel, and I think it's quite clear, a lot of what he's saying is just blatant kind of like lies and stuff. Talking about Ukraine being a threat to Russia, even if I talk about some of the history, the whole history of Ukraine, almost like 30 years, Ukraine's not been involved in any conflict, and Russia has already annexed, territories in Georgia, Chechnya, been involved in multiple conflicts in Syria, backing other kind of tyrannical leaders and such. And again, it's not very, you can't really take anything the Kremlin and Putin says as kind of like truth, even leading up to the conflict, they're making promises. Oh no, the troops on the border, they're not there to invade, they're there just for military exercises, which turned out to be a complete blatant lie. And again, I feel like a lot of what Putin's saying is just almost a projection of himself, talking about Nazification and stuff, when his country is a very nationalistic, autocratic country, so I feel like I just completely refute anything he might say.
Do you have concerns that because it seems whatever Putin claims Ukraine have done, he then does back? I put back in quotation marks. Are you because obviously there's no evidence Ukraine has done what he's accused them of? Are you concerned about the fact that Putin's now claiming Ukraine are plotting to use chemical weapons? Do you think Russia are going to use chemical weapons in Ukraine, bearing in mind that they have, it is believed, used chemical weapons in Syria?
Again, I wouldn't put it past Putin at all. I think his strategy is to entirely blame other people for exactly what he's about to do, It's kind of just trying to paint his own narrative, but it's clear his narrative is completely false. And, if he says, oh, Ukraine's trying to use chemical weapons, it's a cover for him trying to use chemical weapons. And even if the West don't believe it, all it takes is the people in Russia just to believe it, and then that's enough justification for him to send more people just to their deaths needlessly. And the whole conflict is a needless conflict, truly an act of just aggression and imperialism in like the modern world. The reason, again, it doesn't seem very justifiable why Putin would invade a democratic country with leaders that they elected and are peaceful, just trying to better themselves, have self-determination, wanting closer ties with the EU, which they feel they better align with, rather than ties with the Kremlin, where quality of life has been decreasing ever since kind of Putin's been there. And I don't think that's a hard decision to make, Would you rather have ties with a place that's all about progression, democracy, human rights, civil liberties and such, or a country that is run by a tyrannical leader who suppresses civil rights? We're talking about a leader that persecutes gay people, has legalized domestic violence in his country. I think that's quite easy to see what kind of stance Putin has when you hear this kind of things, and it's easy to see why Ukraine might want closer ties to the EU. And it's unfair for Putin to not allow that, use aggressive tactics, violence, again, a full-blown invasion because the country doesn't want to do what he wants to do, despite them being their own country, their own sovereign country.
On your mention of chemical weapons and convincing his own people in Russia that, of course, that as a cover for the use of chemical weapons, it's interesting to see the responses from people in Russia at the moment and the mix. But from what I can tell, generally not that much in support. I saw an exchange on Russian state media where the presenter kind of had to clamp down, I suppose, whether he believes it or not, whether it's kind of been fed into them. And it seemed to be on the interviews that I'd watched that the older people seem to believe Putin more than the younger people do. So I wonder whether you have any comments on his kind of, on how Russians feel about it.
Well, I'm pretty sure a lot of the Russian people don't support what's going on at all. A lot of, again, you're saying about the young Russian people, they're ever more connected to the world. Even during the Soviet Union, people were dying to have more Western life, having open markets, being able to trade with Western countries and have these like Western luxuries and stuff. And even now, people, they're happy to be living with, the Western world, doing things, constantly interacting with people from Russia. If you're playing like a video game, you're online or somewhere, and people get along. And these young Russians, they have no interest in war. What does war benefit them at all?
And that's the power of social media, because of course there have been examples where the Kremlin or anyone behind the scenes have been sharing fake reports. They then break down where these bits of segments have come from. One of them is like loads of body bags on the floor, and one person kind of showing that they're dead, which they've used. That they're not dead, kind of getting out of their body bag in the background while the presenter's reporting. But that's obviously their intention, to use that to show that there aren't actually any deaths going on in Ukraine. But really, that's just an image from some climate protest in Germany. And I guess the young people can see through that. I have a friend from first year who currently lives in Moscow, and she's fully aware of the situation, and I think they're a bit scared of using the WAR word, and also maybe not being able to. She's now put in place different lines of communication so that if Facebook gets shut down, she can still speak to people. That's the reality of their lives there too, the repression going on in Russia.
It's crazy. We're talking about a country that will arrest you for peaceful protests, and there's reports of thousands of people getting arrested, beaten, just for not wanting this war. And I don't know what kind of world or country that is where people get beaten for peacefully protesting, and again not being able to even call it a war without being arrested. Again, it's just a sign of a truly tyrannical kind of regime going on. And I feel with all this kind of knowledge about it, you just can't listen to any of the lies that they say, because they will try and just put whatever they need to say to try and justify atrocities and cover up atrocities with even more lies, and it's quite serious, and it's quite scary, because I feel, again, it's such a Western value to have freedom of speech, and you go to a country like Russia, you don't have freedom of speech. Your life is at risk trying to criticize the government, and it's not even the government really, it's just one person, and that's Putin, who's perpetuating this kind of regime.
Breaking news, Vladimir Putin shows no willingness to end Ukraine war during the latest talks with French and German leaders. That's breaking news from BBC News, so there's no letting up of it.
Well, how do you think this is going to end? Or is it going to end? Are we going to be seeing this for years on years on years? Or do you think Putin's got his eyes on other countries as well?
Well, I hope that the Russian people can sort themselves out, essentially, if that requires them to remove Putin, if that requires his inner circle removing him. It seems what's necessary is like a regime change in Russia, and I think that'll be most beneficial for the Russian people, who have been suffering under this regime just as much as anyone else. And I'm fairly certain Putin doesn't just have his eyes on Ukraine. He probably will happily expand, but it doesn't seem like his progression in Ukraine's been going too well, so it doesn't, who knows if he'll push further. He's lost a lot of his face the whole world is demonizing what he's doing quite rightly. Again, Putin is a man that probably cares quite a lot about his image, you know, trying to portray himself as a strong, powerful leader, yet, you know, hides in a bunker while he sends, you know, young men 18 years old to die for a cause they don't even know or care about, you know. And what's even more atrocious, again, is sending these people to die. And I don't know if you've heard like the interviews with Putin, and he would, in the same breath that, you know, he would call Ukrainian people his brothers, and then the next day he sends his people to go kill people that he's called his brothers,
and purposely target hospitals that had Ukrainian people using as a base, and kindergartens for poor kids, which is and even bombing humanitarian corridors. These
exactly.
After this happens, it is going to be a war crime tribunal.
Entirely. Again, I don't know what, you know. There's no Nazis in a kindergarten, is there?
No, exactly.
It's unjustifiable what he's doing, indiscriminately targeting civilian areas, and truly just a madman, really.
Josh, as a fellow politics student, have you got anything to comment on those early topics that we've just discussed?
I mean, Felix raised an interesting question. Where do we think this is going to go? How do we think this is going to end? And unfortunately, at the minute, it seems hard to picture any end point in near future. So, on the one hand, the Ukrainian armed forces have done a remarkable job, all things considered, of actually holding up the country under an assault from a much larger military nation. And I think it's quite clear Putin expected things to go differently, and it's quite clear he didn't think that Ukraine would hold out this long. So that's something we can all be very thankful for, that they've continued to hold out. My fear is, as Felix was mentioning earlier, with these words Putin's spreading about the Ukrainians having used chemical weapons, which just isn't true, that because they're losing the war, they're resorting to more and more drastic measures, and they're bringing up chemical weapons as an excuse so they themselves can use them to make further military advances, which they've been struggling to make thus far. So that's very concerning. We've got this interesting situation where Western nations, whether it be the EU and the US, we've hit Russia with essentially weapons of mass destruction in the form of these sanctions. Now, Russia has been preparing for attacks like this for years and years and years. They built up these essentially stockpiles of money so that they could weather out sanctions like this. But our sanctions have gone really our sanctions have been extremely extensive, perhaps more so than Putin ever imagined. So Russia had something called the Fortress, which was like this big reserve of money in bonds, in gold, etc. And that was estimated to be about $640 billion worth of money.
The war chest.
The war chest, exactly. And through sanctions with the EU, the UK, the United States, we've reduced that amount of money to realistically about 30 billion. So actually they don't have anywhere near as much to play with as they once anticipated. Now, in order to bring about an end to this war, or my hope is that US, UK, EU can sort of use that as leverage, because I think unless we start making the veiled offer of perhaps lifting some of these sanctions for withdrawal, Putin has no incentive to leave the country.
Sort of put him into a corner where the only way out in his mind is to carry on fighting a war that is not going to be winnable perhaps by either side. You mentioned about escalating to chemical weapons. Of course, Putin has also used nuclear weapons in his speeches. Do you think that he is
bragged about being one of the strongest nuclear powers?
And they do have the most amount of nuclear weapons in the world. Do you think Putin is going to use nuclear weapons? Do you think he's capable of using nuclear weapons?
Just hope not, you know. hope it's just kind of a bluff. Obviously it shows his kind of fear. I feel like his threat of using nuclear weapons is just a sign showing that he couldn't deal with a full-scale war of NATO. The only way he could deal with it is nuclear, you know. And I think that just shows almost like a weakness, you know, if you have to use your most extreme measure just to prevent people doing things. I guess it's working for him at the moment as NATO aren't intervening, but I think it's a sign of weakness, but I wouldn't put it past a crazy man to use them, you know.
I think it's very unlikely, but at the same time we really don't have an understanding of Putin's rationale. Like before the invasion, when Russia had troops on the border of Ukraine, lots of analysts didn't actually think an invasion was going to happen because it made no sense. Yet here we are months later and we're 3 weeks into a war, and it's just one of those things. I genuinely don't know, right? Putin sometimes says stuff like, well, what's the point of living in a world in which Russia doesn't have a large role? And if you accept that as a premise, then maybe nuclear war isn't that far. I don't think it's likely, but at the same time, I did have a nightmare last night about nuclear weapons going off, so who knows? Like, I'm that scared.
It's in your psyche, yeah.
I think it shows Putin's stance, because if he really cared about the Russian people, he wouldn't think about using nuclear weapons at all, because that doesn't benefit the everyday person. It doesn't benefit anyone anywhere. And again, it just shows his very selfish. It's not about Russia, it's about Putin, you know. It's not about the Russian people, it's about his own personal goals that he's trying to achieve for whatever reason, you know, being stuck in kind of an old mentality. And again, if he really cared about the Russian people, he wouldn't be going to war. He'd be developing, you know, trying to increase quality of life, trying to increase, you know, the amount of money in the country, increase things like jobs, you know, normal things that a leader of a country would be trying to do, not, you know, decimate his own population in war, allow these sanctions completely destroy his economy. Yeah, Russia might have a war chest full of money prepared, but the everyday Russian doesn't, you know? They don't have money laying about. At the moment, the ruble's crashing. All that they can withdraw in the country is rubles. You know, the people that are suffering the most isn't Putin.
Well,
it's people.
It isn't Putin, but maybe money-wise, it is the case that he will be making a personal loss by quite a significant margin, because I found out that his wealth is pretty monumentally big, maybe Elon Musk equivalent. We don't quite know. And also he has huge investments in the top 2 oil companies in Russia. So he is taking, I mean, it's bonkers really. He is taking a huge personal hit from this. But we mentioned about sanctions. I wonder, Arthur, what your perspective is on whether we should be we are targeting Russian oligarchs in the hope that maybe that will freeze up some of their money so that they can't fuel the war machine. I'm sure some of them are more in it than others. But have you got any comments on actions and sanctions that Josh mentioned in order to try and alleviate this?
I think sanctions are a worthwhile thing, you know. It's a way that we can wage war against kind of like Russia without firing any shots. However, I feel the way the UK's particularly gone about it seems very almost lackluster. It seems
it's
like
at least been presented that way in the media.
Well, it seems that they're only targeting a few specific oligarchs, making sure they're not targeting any donors to UK political parties and such, allowing them up to like a month or a couple of months before the sanctions hit them, which just lets them take the money out and put it somewhere else, which completely negates the point of a sanction anyway.
Though the government has been stronger than most of Europe on the German bank, on the Russian banks.
And a poll conducted for Ukrainian people, interestingly, which was done by an American company called Signal, but with a C rather than an S, which polled that Boris Johnson had a net favourability of 50, which was the highest of any foreign leader amongst Ukrainian people, with Joe Biden coming second with a positive net rating of 26.
I see, that's interesting. So maybe Boris Johnson's a more popular Prime Minister in Ukraine than he is in the UK.
By a long way. I mean, anyone getting a positive rating of 50 in this country would be off the chart, because we don't tend to like any of our politicians. But do you think then the Ukrainian people, although of course many of these comments you mentioned are issues I'm sure many Ukrainians would wish the UK to be harsher on oligarchs and so forth, but perhaps they are grateful that the UK has been sending military weapons at a time when Germany was blocking resources going to Ukraine, military resources.
I think they're very thankful, you know, and they are thankful for both the weapons and things like the sanctions. I think especially the weapons, because they do credit the UK as being some of the best at kind of sending weapons over and such. Unlike the sanctions, I don't know how much the average Ukrainian person knows on the exact sanctions that are being put and how they're being put.
They probably don't have time to think about that.
Yeah, they probably don't even, you know, how do they access that kind of information?
When all your Wi-Fi's down, I'm sure it's been bad.
To be honest, I'm sure that poll has some credibility to it, but at the same time, they are polling in a war zone. Like, it's not easy to get scientific data on this sort of thing.
So obviously the issue with the West going or NATO going into Ukraine to defend them is because NATO itself, the Ukraine was not part of NATO, and if it had gone into NATO, I think it might be a different story. I'm not entirely sure in what way it would have been a different story, but it would have been
one way or the other.
But it came up on the question time debate. Somebody from the audience asked the really interesting question, well, what about Norway or Sweden or the ones up there that border Russia? Well, what about them? What if Russia goes and invades them? It's exactly the same story in the sense that they are not NATO members. However, they do military practices with NATO, so it would be an even more difficult one because NATO is only a defensive alliance, and that's why they're sending in only defensive weapons like anti-aircraft and anti-tank instead of ones that you can actively kind of go over the border and bring along and invade Russia with. So psychologically, one of the ex-prime minister of one of the countries, I can't remember which country she was, but she said she said that's a very good point, and she said they should have joined years ago. In the hope of them being neutral, they're now
a member of NATO, just to clarify.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, but Sweden and Finland.
Yeah, right. So now this is a tricky situation of if we allow Russia to go into Ukraine and expect Ukraine just to fight against them on their own. Well, what about the other countries if he so desired?
And he has threatened Sweden and Finland, of course, as well.
Yeah, entirely. I think, well, before the actual invasion, and I guess towards the very start of it, it might have been, like, you know, it would have been fully, people would have thought it would have been fully within Russia's power to maybe take over somewhere like Finland. And I think, like, I've heard a lot that they're now pushing a lot, and the people in Finland are really approving of joining NATO, and obviously this whole thing has galvanized NATO, given them a new purpose and such and the like. But I feel with the conflict in Ukraine, again, Russia seem almost weak. I don't think that it might be even in their power to be invading other countries. Invading, you know, there's already history of Russia trying to invade, well, the Soviet Union trying to invade Finland, and it being a disaster.
Very tricky terrain to fight in.
Exactly, and you can't expect people that aren't used to that terrain to fight better than people that live there their whole lives. And again, if you're seeing what's happening in Ukraine, the Ukrainian people seem to be holding off pretty decently, and if Russia have to stretch their resources even further to attack somewhere like Finland, again, they're opening themselves up. I think it's, again, I'm not a military expert, but I'm pretty sure it'll be quite...
But what a crazy thing to say. I mean, just imagine us going, oh, right, we're being invaded, so we're doing a really good job, actually, of holding off the aggressor. It's mental that normal people in this 21st century we live in still have to... Like, several months ago would be minding their own business, and now are having to fight a war. Josh, you were going to come in.
I was just going to say, like, you're all absolutely right. NATO membership is going to be a hot topic in the Scandinavian elections later over the coming years. But also, isn't it remarkable how Putin, in a single move after decades of trying to weaken NATO, weaken the European Union, has sort of single-handedly created in Russia a common enemy by invading Ukraine.
Yeah. And even China doesn't want to get involved.
And
And even
Hungary,
China-
Putin's best mate Orban has criticised him now as well.
Yeah, we'll talk about that this morning.
The EU's never been stronger. Like, Brexit, ironically, might have actually made the EU stronger because now they no longer have a reluctant partner in the UK and are willing to do more stuff. He's managed to single-handedly shift Germany's military policy, so they're now spending like $2 billion a year, which is bonkers from where they were just weeks ago. Like, it's insane.
And Josh, on a similar point,
Yeah.
it came up in, I think it was from the Ukrainian ambassador, who was asked, well, Ukraine got rid of nuclear weapons, or chose to not have nuclear weapons. I can't remember which one.
It was to get rid of them,
They got rid of them on the promise that the rest of the world would protect them. Do you think that this is case in point as an example as to why countries should have nuclear weapons? Or, on the other hand, do you think that the very fact that we're so close to a nuclear war with an absolute mentalist who thinks that a world without Russia is not a world worth living in, on the other hand, do you think it's maybe extra reason to be anti-nukes?
It is certainly far harder to imagine now a situation where any country would be willing to give up their nuclear weapons. As you were saying, Thomas, Ukraine gave up their nuclear weapons in part because of a promise that Western countries would protect them. Now, we've done some stuff with the sanctions, etc. listed, but it's clear we've not saved them from a Russian invasion. I don't think countries now will be prepared to give up their nuclear weapons because it's just clear, unless you're a member of NATO, we're not going to intervene to save you in these situations. And so I think maybe it does make an argument for nuclear weapons. I'm not convinced, but maybe.
And as a Ukrainian born, any last comments on nuclear or the Russia-Ukraine crisis before we continue?
Not too much on the nuclear part. Again, I'm sure the Ukrainian people kind of wish they had some nukes of their own right now, so to act as a deterrent. But I think nuclear weapons kind of a tricky subject, you know. They kind of prevent kind of the full-scale wars that, you know, happened during the start of the 20th century. You know, countries are too scared to go fully at war because, you know, you have the threat of nukes. And in a weird way, it kept some peace, but it also keeps everyone on that edge of pure destruction, you know. So it's a tough topic, I think.
It's a difficult one. Well, thanks for your comments on Russia-Ukraine. We're going to move on to a bit of more of a domestic discussion on our next topic about Gavin Williamson. But for the moment, this is REM. It's the End of the World. And we're back. That was It's the End of the World as We Know It by REM. Now, it's the end of the world as we know it indeed. The topic currently that we're moving on to is about Gavin Williamson. Do you remember Gavin Williamson? He was the he's held several positions. He was Defence Secretary, where he got in trouble for breaking cabinet policy, and he says he didn't, but we all know he did. He shared some secrets, and then as Education Secretary, he did the whole predicted grades planning for A levels and GCSEs, which I don't know. I wasn't a huge fan with his solution to the COVID situation and calculating grades. It was a controversial one on account of private school students in smaller classes tending to get higher grades, and not just because of their performance. Something wrong with the algorithm. Well, anyway, this is Gavin Williamson. It's now myself, Felix, and Josh.
Well, Sir Gavin Williamson. I think
sorry,
we should address him as.
Sir, yeah, I don't think.
I think you get the title automatically as
my
soon
goodness
as you're
me.
appointed.
Well, Dom Raab was asked, how do you feel about it? And he said, well, Gavin Williamson has done a service to his country, and he stood down as cabinet member.
He's so great that Boris Johnson had to sack him in the most recent
Josh, any comments?
Where to begin? I guess we'll begin with his resignation/sacking after leaking national security information.
Yeah.
Now, let's break down the lunacy of this whole scenario. So this was under Theresa May's government, and Gavin Williamson was accused of leaking national security information. Now, this is bad for any cabinet minister. It's particularly bad when you're the defence secretary. Like, that's quite an important part of a role. Not leaking national security information. Failed at that job. Now, in fairness, to this day, he still denies that he ever did it. But that's a whole other issue, because Theresa May's government refused to ever hold an investigation, so we still don't actually know. Gavin Williamson might have just been the scapegoat. I don't believe he was. I believe he probably did leak it. But he still denies it, and we still don't know for sure. So that really ought to be like a black mark against his name from ever getting any sort of acknowledgement of this kind. Then, having left the cabinet, he was reincorporated under Boris Johnson as Education Secretary, because apparently people in politics have the memory of a goldfish.
And education has no national security secrets to leak.
Well, true. And this was under COVID. Obviously, coronavirus, this became a huge thing. Pandemic had a huge impact on education. People were being educated from home, etc. And whilst that was a real travesty and caused all sorts of problems which weren't necessarily his fault, they did have like 6 months or so where they were probably pretty aware of what was going to happen with GCSEs and A-levels. Like, they knew they weren't going to be able to sit them in the ordinary way. And they came up with this algorithm which was going to determine what grades they gave students. Sounds fine on the base of it, except this algorithm disproportionately favoured students from wealthier backgrounds as opposed to poorer backgrounds, so private school students did particularly well under this.
It was a bit moronic, really, wasn't it?
It was really, really not great. And
I did actually write an article about this on the Political Natter, if anybody is, and also for
it's very good.
the University Impact magazine. Because there's now 3 of us, I'm now breaking impartiality. Yeah, it was moronic. That's just all I'm saying.
So the thing was, this was like an algorithm which should have been tested within an inch of its life, right? They should have discovered this long before grades were ever published. Yet it took grades being published and a huge public outcry to get things changed, and they did revert to teacher predicted grades in the end, which was the right decision, but it should have happened weeks before, or they should have fixed the algorithm, because what instead happened was it came too late for many people. People had been given the grades and had already found alternatives, and it's just tragedy, really.
Well, one of the points you mentioned there, Josh, about having the time to fix the system, of course, a similar situation happened in Scotland first, but the British government didn't change the system despite the backlash the Scottish government received. So they saw the Scottish government get criticised, make a U-turn, and then the British government did the exact same thing. And of course, both years, we're talking 2020 and 2021, there were issues because of grade inflation as well, which has come from teacher prediction grades. But I suppose there is no system that would have been completely perfect. I'll put it to you. I mean, I'm not again, if we're breaking impartiality now, there's 3 of us, there's more discussion. I'm not a fan of Sir Gavin either, but just to put something from his perspective to benefit him, he would perhaps argue with the algorithm that private schools do tend to do better, quite a lot better than state schools with results anyway. So the algorithm just boosted everybody up, but because private schools were already ahead of state schools, it just made them look even more ahead than they were before.
Right. But you see, the algorithm they designed was, in a sense, built around the notion of entrenched privilege within our society, and they ought to have found that and changed it. I think they ought to find that and change that within our actual society and not just within the algorithm. But I sort of accept the argument. I think it's funny, like all the Conservative ministers at the time, we're going, it's a mutant algorithm, it's a mutant algorithm. Can I just like establish, this isn't like science fiction. Algorithms don't tend to mutate. What it is an algorithm is a product of human computing. And what you input has a direct correlation with the output. This didn't just create itself. This was a series of code which was written by someone. So the fact that it produced higher grades for private school students, etc., was a key result of them not looking at the algorithm properly.
Why do you think Boris Johnson has given a knighthood to Gavin Williamson? And do you think that this has made a mockery of the honours system, which is quite well respected by most people across the country and indeed the world, the system we have here? Do you think this just sort of takes a mockery that if someone like Gavin Williamson can get a knighthood, then, well, anyone could get a knighthood? I mean, obviously in a normal circumstance, I suppose anyone getting a knighthood is a good idea, but when you're looking at, when I mean by anyone, I mean someone that's not done the best of jobs by most consensus.
Felix, come on, you what's your point about the people that supported Brexit in the House of Lords? The wasn't there like loads of people have ended up in the House of Lords and supported Brexit. There was something you mentioned about that.
Yeah, I'm doing a dissertation on MPs that resigned the whip under Jeremy Corbyn, and there is a strong correlation to those that ended up supporting the Conservatives rather than the Liberal Democrats, and peerages being awarded. But I suppose that's a different system to the honours system.
Yeah.
That's a different issue. But do you think that why do you think he's been given the knighthood? Because not every ex-cabinet minister gets a knighthood. In fact, quite a lot don't. Do you think perhaps Gavin Williamson might have something on Boris, as he was the former chief whip?
No, I don't. I mean, maybe he does. It's possible. I suspect it's probably more to do with loyalty. So, Boris Johnson has kept on many people in his cabinet who should have been fired long ago, but who have shown him pretty much unwavering loyalty throughout difficult and hard times during his premiership. And I suspect that's why Gavin Williamson's been rewarded, because he was always an avid supporter of Johnson, and he's always been there for him. Is it loyalty over, like, common sense? Is this an award patronising the people who have stuck with him rather than people who deserve it? I would say so, probably.
Interesting. Well, I wonder who else will be getting knighthoods in the future.
I have one.
Yeah, Sir Thomas Gregory for services to broadcasting. Should we move on to the next topic?
Yeah, I think we should. Why don't we move on? What are we doing after the break, Felix?
We're going to be doing Nigel Farage's latest endeavour, and I know Josh is a huge fan of Nigel Farage.
Oh, yeah.
It's on his referendum campaign for net zero.
Yeah, take that. It's the greatest day.
And welcome back to The Big Picture, which turns out not to be live on University Radio Nottingham. That's just a reference to how some technical things that are going on at the moment. Anyway, our third and final topic of today, and where we're joined by Josh, is Nigel Farage's latest endeavour, which is his referendum on net zero. He's started a campaign with Richard Tice, who's the now leader of Reform UK, which is the Brexit Party's successor, and it's called Vote Power, Not Poverty. And they've even had a Labour MP sign up to this, Graham Stringer, who is in the minority of the Labour MPs on his climate views. Now, referendums in this country tend to be rare, and they tend to be on constitutional issues, not on policy issues such as net zero. And bearing in mind that all major parties had a degree of some policy towards net zero in the last election. So is it like, and also a lot of people in the UK support going to net zero. I mean, they might differentiate on when exactly they want net zero to be reached, but there is a consensus amongst the population to try and achieve this. So is this going to actually work for Nigel Farage, or is he going to do what he did with Brexit and defy the establishment, and eventually there is going to be a referendum on this, and eventually he'll win it? What do you think?
So, one should never underestimate Nigel Farage. He did genuinely change the debate around Brexit and brought the idea of leaving the European Union from a tiny issue into something which is debated across the country and eventually happened despite my best attempts to stop it.
Your personal vendetta.
My personal vendetta to stop it, yes. On the other hand, I don't think this issue is something he can win on. Climate change is something which for the past 30, 40 years has been taught to children in schools. It's been ingrained in our young people for decades, as I was saying. Like, I don't think he's understood the thought and will of the people on this and how strongly people are in favour of trying to do something to save the planet. And I don't think he can change public perception.
Do you also think perhaps Nigel Farage is just looking for his latest thing to do now he's actually achieved his life ambition? Because Reform UK, his party that he's not the leader of now but still a member, is polling at about 3% in the polls. So it's not particularly high. It might be enough actually to make the Conservatives lose a couple of seats in some places by taking some votes from them, but it's not really a relevant party in the same sense that UKIP was in its heyday, or the Brexit Party in its heyday. Do you think this is just him trying to find something to do, I suppose?
I mean, absolutely, he's trying to replay the glory days when he was at the centre of British politics, but at the same time, I don't think he'd choose this topic if he didn't think he could make some impact on it. Like, he's not just gone for something at total random. I mean, if I were him, which I never would be, if I were him, I might have chosen something else that the Reform Party were in favour of, like electoral reform, and because that genuinely could make a tangible impact on British politics for the better. I don't know.
Well, it would mean perhaps Nigel Farage might be in Parliament if we had electoral reform, Josh.
Yes.
So according to the New European, Nigel Farage's call for a net zero referendum is a final desperate bid for relevance. So would you agree with that, Josh?
That sums it up, I think. Yeah.
I cannot see, I'm afraid. I know this is all, I can't see Brexit happening, right? I cannot see there being a lack of support for net zero. I think most people think it's very reasonable that we should be moving to an economy where we can rely on renewables and nuclear rather than carbon emissions by 2050. I think that's a perfectly reasonable thing. The evidence is so overwhelmingly true that we need to focus on this, not just as a country but as a world. How on earth are we going to, and how on earth is he going to be granted a referendum, let alone actually if he's right or not?
That I genuinely don't know. Maybe it was just he wanted the topic to be talked about and this was his attempt to get it on the news. It sort of worked. Yeah. This makes no sense as a referendum topic either, because like, at least with like the issue of the European Union, we had a history of like uneasy relations with the Union, and there was a genuine question over whether people felt a European identity or not. Whereas this, climate change is something which scientists have known about for decades, and policy on this matter should be made by the scientists who know what they're talking about. A public opinion poll doesn't make much sense.
Well, also, with the referendum, let's say that hypothetically this referendum happened and hypothetically speaking the British public voted the way Nigel Farage wanted and we didn't vote for net zero. Does that mean that that's it? You know, so doesn't matter what happens from now on, we just have to allow climate change to happen and not do anything? Like, what is it? Would it be binding forever? We just sit back and like that's it now? I mean, I was just looking up some Ipsos Mori polls,
as you do,
for net zero, and the lowest sort of policy they've got here with support from the British public, it still has higher support than opposition, and that is higher taxes on meat. And right. So even most people support that over not supporting that, and that is the lowest, and that's 47% support against 32% that oppose, and I imagine the rest don't know. But you've got things like frequent fly levies with 68% supporting. So there is a strong consensus, much more than the European Union, on net zero. I think that also, as I'm not being impartial, I think Nigel Farage has sort of lost contact with his sort of support base in a way. He previously was anti-lockdown, but actually the people that sort of were his voters were more inclined to support lockdown, because it was the young that were the most anti-lockdown generation, but they don't tend to be big fans of Nigel Farage, whilst the old, which are polling were more in favour of lockdown, do like Nigel Farage more. So maybe he's not actually in tune with his support base, but I suppose
he's in tune with his
niche group,
with his niche support base.
Yeah.
But those are always the people he was targeting, and then he seems to have a magical ability to convert the general public to that point of view as well.
So do you think then that actually if we hear more and more of Nigel Farage, more and more people might think, well, hang on a minute, maybe we shouldn't reach net zero, perhaps this is too much money on for us to pay, particularly with the high energy prices and things going on?
No, but I do think the very debate is enough that it can be damaging, and the last thing we need with climate change the way it is hesitancy, because it's like little bits of hesitancy are what's stopping us from moving forward as a country on renewables, and the faster we make the change, the less damage it will be later on.
Well, that's it for our show. Thank you very much, Josh, for your commentary on all of these topics, and thanks to Arthur for his contribution on the Russia-Ukraine situation. It's a sad world. It's a sad world is the way I like to end most of these recent most of these recent shows, because the suffering that's going on in Ukraine is bananas, and adding a climate catastrophe into the mix as well really would leave us in a bad place. And to lead us out is an absolute banger from U2 that I discovered last week and can't stop listening to. This is, fittingly, Where the Streets Have No Name.